Japan's history is one of the most fascinating and unique in the world. It's the story of an island nation shaped by its geography, molded by its encounters with outside forces, and defined by a culture that has always balanced the ancient and the modern, the spiritual and the pragmatic, the artistic and the disciplined. Unlike many civilizations that rose and fell through the centuries, Japan's story is marked by an extraordinary continuity, an unbroken imperial line, traditions that stretch back thousands of years, and a sense of identity that has endured war, isolation, and transformation. To understand Japan is to understand a people who have been both fiercely independent and deeply receptive to the world. From its earliest pottery-making tribes to its cutting-edge robotics, from the days of samurai to anime and high-speed trains, Japan has constantly reinvented itself without ever losing sight of its essence. The journey of Japan is not a straight line, but a tapestry, woven through wars and peace, gods and emperors, swords and scrolls, poems and policies. This video is divided into 7 parts, with the first 6 parts each covering a distinct era in Japanese history, from its prehistoric roots to the modern day. Along the way, we'll explore the rise and fall of clans, the evolution of art and religion, the clash of ideologies, and the pivotal moments that shape the nation's destiny. The last part is a bonus section that includes topics like the role of women throughout Japanese history and Japan's influence on global culture. Whether you're new to Japanese history or revisiting it with fresh eyes, this is your chance to witness the full sweep of a civilization unlike any other. Let's begin. Part 1. Prehistoric and Ancient Japan. Jomon Period, 14,000 to 300 BCE. Japan's history begins far before emperors, samurai, or even rice paddies. The Jomon period, stretching from around 14,000 BCE to 300 BCE, marks one of the world's oldest continuous cultures. It was a time before written records, before cities, and before agriculture, as we usually imagine it. But far from being primitive, the Jomon people developed a complex and spiritually rich way of life. They lived as sophisticated hunter-gatherers, relying on Japan's rich natural environment, fishing in rivers and along the coasts, hunting wild animals, and gathering chestnuts, acorns, and edible roots from the forests. Their diet was diverse and seasonal, and they likely had a deep understanding of the land that sustained them. One of the most striking features of the Jomon culture is their pottery. In fact, the term Jomon means cord-marked, referring to the rope-like patterns pressed into their clay vessels. These pots weren't just functional, they were beautiful. Some were shaped with elaborate flares and curves, suggesting that artistic expression had meaning even in the oldest layers of Japanese history. Many of these vessels were used for cooking, but others appear to have had ceremonial or symbolic purposes. Over time, their pottery became more decorative, possibly reflecting changes in belief systems or social structures. The Jomon people lived in small communities, often in pit dwellings dug into the ground and covered with thatched roofs. These homes clustered near rivers or coastal regions, where food was plentiful. Archaeological sites have revealed large shell mounds, the remains of meals eaten over generations, and within them, scientists have found fish bones, tools, and even jewelry, giving us an intimate view of daily life in prehistoric Japan. We also find clay figurines known as do-gu, small, often female-shaped figures that may have represented fertility, spirits, or deities. Their purpose remains a mystery, but their repeated appearance across centuries suggests that the Jomon people had spiritual beliefs and ritual practices deeply woven into their lives. Over the course of more than 10 millennia, Jomon society slowly evolved. In later stages of the period, we begin to see signs of early plant cultivation, perhaps the first steps toward agriculture. Trade networks emerged, evidenced by obsidian and other materials found far from their source, pointing to long-distance exchange. These people may not have built kingdoms, but they built a culture that endured longer than most civilizations in history. The Jomon era wasn't just a prologue to Japan. It was a vast and vibrant world of its own. Its people lived in harmony with the land, crafted with care, and thought deeply about life and death. Though we may never fully understand their worldview, the fingerprints they left on the earth, in pottery, figurines, and ancient campsites, still speak to us across the silence of thousands of years. Yayoi Period, 300 BCE to 250 CE. The Yayoi Period, spanning from around 300 BCE to 250 CE, marks one of the most transformative eras in Japanese prehistory. It witnessed the arrival of new technologies, cultural practices, and social structures that dramatically reshaped the archipelago. Named after a neighborhood in Tokyo, where distinctive pottery was first discovered, the Yayoi era introduced wet rice agriculture to Japan, fundamentally changing how communities sustained themselves. This agricultural shift likely came from contact with the Korean Peninsula or mainland China, and it led to more permanent settlements, surpluses of food, and the beginning of complex societal hierarchies. The tools and materials from this period show a remarkable leap forward. Bronze and iron technology began to replace the stone tools of the earlier Jomon people. Iron was mainly used for tools and weapons, while bronze was used ceremonially, for bells known as dotaku, mirrors, and spears. The presence of these objects, especially in burial sites, suggests the rise of powerful clans and regional leaders who could command resources and labor. These elite groups likely used their wealth and control over agriculture to assert dominance, laying the groundwork for Japan's later feudal structure. Culturally, the Yayoi people are believed to have migrated from the Asian mainland, bringing with them not only technology and farming methods, but also new religious and social customs. While the Jomon people continued to exist, there is evidence that Yayoi culture gradually absorbed or displaced Jomon traditions. Burial mounds from this time, though simpler than later Kofun, still hint at stratified societies and ancestor worship, possibly early forms of what would evolve into Shinto beliefs. Trade and communication flourished, both within the islands and across the sea. Japan's early ties to the Korean peninsula grew stronger, and Chinese records from the Han Dynasty mention a land called Wa, describing a fragmented society of small tribal states. Among them, a female ruler named Himiko would eventually rise to prominence toward the end of this period, hinting at early political unification efforts and diplomacy. By the close of the Yayoi period, Japan had transitioned from a collection of hunter-gatherer tribes to a network of agricultural societies connected by trade, war, and shifting alliances. The stage was set for the next phase of Japan's history, one that would bring even greater centralization of power and the birth of an imperial tradition. Kofun Period, 250 to 538 CE. Around 250 CE, Japan entered a transformative era known as the Kofun Period, named after the massive burial mounds, or kofun, that began to dot the landscape. These tombs, some shaped like keyholes and spanning hundreds of meters in length, were constructed for powerful rulers and elite figures, signaling the rise of a new kind of political and social structure. The sheer scale and uniformity of these tombs suggest a significant consolidation of power, and it's during this time that the Yamato clan began to assert dominance over much of the Japanese archipelago. The Yamato rulers gradually extended their influence through military conquest, strategic alliances, and the integration of regional clans into a broader political network. Although the emperors of Japan trace their lineage back further, it's during the Kofun period that we see the foundations of the Japanese imperial institution taking recognizable form. These early rulers likely served not only political roles, but also religious ones, acting as intermediaries between the people and the gods. Artifacts from this era, such as bronze mirrors, iron weapons, and clay Haniwa figurines placed around the tombs, reveal a society growing in complexity and stratification. Haniwa were more than just decorations. They likely served spiritual or ritual functions, acting as guardians or symbols of the person buried within. Trade and cultural contact with the Korean Peninsula and China also intensified during this time, bringing new technologies, continental-style armor, horse riding, and advanced metallurgy into Japan. These exchanges would continue to reshape Japanese society and set the stage for the full-scale introduction of Buddhism and Chinese writing systems in the following centuries. Though much of the Kofun period remains shrouded in mystery, due in part to imperial restrictions on excavating key tombs, it marks the dawn of a centralized Japan. The blending of indigenous traditions with continental influences laid the groundwork for the classical state to come, and the mythic history recorded in later texts begins to blur with the political realities that took shape in this era. In many ways, the Kofun period is the bridge between prehistoric tribal Japan and the sophisticated imperial culture that would soon emerge. Part 2. Classical Japan. Asuka Period, 538 to 710. In the Asuka period, Japan underwent one of the most significant transformations in its early history, marking a profound shift in politics, religion, and cultural identity. This era began with the introduction of Buddhism to the Japanese archipelago, brought over from the Korean kingdom of Baekje. More than a new religion, Buddhism introduced complex philosophies, art, architecture, and an expanded sense of cosmology that would challenge and eventually intertwine with native Shinto beliefs. The ruling Yamato court, seeking to centralize power and legitimize their authority, gradually embraced Buddhism and its associated Chinese political models, which emphasized imperial rule as divinely sanctioned. One of the central figures in this transformation was Prince Shotoku, a regent and statesman remembered for his efforts to strengthen the central government and for promoting Buddhist and Confucian values. Under his influence, Japan saw the adoption of the 17-article constitution, which, although more of a moral code than a legal document, laid the groundwork for a bureaucratic state inspired by Chinese models. It emphasized harmony, reverence for the emperor, and moral governance, values that would echo through Japanese political thought for centuries. During this period, Japan began sending official envoys to China under the Sui and Tang dynasties, known as the Kintoshi missions. These diplomatic and cultural exchanges brought back not just political concepts, but also advancements in technology, architecture, writing, and art. The Chinese writing system was gradually adapted to the Japanese language, forming the basis for a literate bureaucracy and historical record-keeping. Meanwhile, political intrigue simmered beneath the surface. The Soga clan, strong supporters of Buddhism, rose to dominance in court politics, facing opposition from more conservative factions that remained loyal to traditional Shinto values. This rivalry culminated in a violent power struggle, most notably the Ishii Incident of 645, in which the reformist faction led by Prince Naka no Oe, later Emperor Tenji, overthrew the Soga and launched what came to be known as the Taika Reforms. These reforms were a direct attempt to further centralize the Japanese state under imperial rule, abolishing private landholdings in favor of a public land system modeled after Chinese administrative practices. The goal was to weaken the powerful clans and strengthen the emperor's authority by asserting state control over land and resources. The reforms also reorganized local governance, introduced land surveys, and instituted a taxation system. By the end of the Asuka period, Japan was no longer a loose collection of rival clans, but was evolving into a more unified and bureaucratically managed state. The foundations of classical Japanese civilization had been laid. The adoption of Chinese-style governance, Buddhism, and Confucian ethics reshaped Japan's identity and set the stage for the flourishing culture and centralized power that would characterize the next era. The Asuka period, though brief, stands as a turning point when Japan began to consciously define itself as a nation, with its own distinct blend of indigenous traditions and foreign innovations. Nara Period, 710 to 794. In the year 710, Japan entered a new era with the establishment of its first permanent capital at Nara, modeled after the great Chinese city of Chang'an. This marked the beginning of the Nara period, a time when the young Japanese state began to solidify its identity under imperial rule while embracing significant influences from the continent. Buddhism, having been introduced earlier, now became a central force in political and cultural life, deeply intertwined with the state. Grand temples such as Todaiji were constructed, housing monumental statues like the Great Buddha, a symbol of both religious devotion and imperial authority. The court sought to strengthen its legitimacy by recording its own version of history and mythology. Two of Japan's oldest surviving texts, the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, were compiled during this time. These works trace the imperial lineage back to the sun goddess Amaterasu, weaving together myth and politics to justify the emperor's divine right to rule. The state also worked to codify laws, organize taxation, and control land distribution through a centralized bureaucratic system modeled after China's Tang dynasty. These efforts, however, often clashed with local realities and the entrenched power of aristocratic families and Buddhist institutions. The fusion of native Shinto beliefs with the imported practices of Buddhism began to take a unique form during this period. Religious institutions became enormously powerful, with temples amassing wealth and influence that sometimes rivaled the state. This growing power, particularly that of temple complexes like Todaiji and the monk Dokyo's influence over Empress Shotoku, led to tension between the religious and political spheres. In fact, Dokyo's attempted usurpation of the throne shocked the court and contributed to a growing concern over the entanglement of Buddhism with governance. Life in the capital flourished culturally, with increased literacy, the development of a written language, and artistic innovations influenced by both indigenous traditions and imported Chinese aesthetics. Yet the government struggled to maintain control over distant provinces, and its efforts to enforce a rigid land redistribution system began to unravel. Wealthy families and temples found ways to circumvent state control, amassing private lands known as shuin, which would later become the foundation of the feudal order. By the end of the Nara period, the tensions between centralization and decentralization, religion and state, had begun to take shape. The capital would eventually move to Heian, modern-day Kyoto, marking the end of this brief yet formative chapter. The Nara period set the stage for the cultural flowering and political experiments of the Heian era, and its legacy is still visible today in Japan's religious architecture, historical records, and the enduring myths that support the imperial institution. Heian Period, 794 to 1185. In 794, Japan's imperial court moved to a new capital, Heian, present-day Kyoto. This marked the beginning of the Heian period, one of the most culturally significant and artistically vibrant eras in Japanese history. During this time, power began to shift away from the emperor and toward aristocratic families, most notably the Fujiwara clan, who wielded influence by marrying their daughters into the imperial line and acting as regents for child emperors. The Heian period was characterized by peace and stability in the capital, which allowed the arts to flourish. It was a time of courtly refinement and aesthetic sophistication. Aristocrats engaged in elaborate rituals, poetry competitions, and seasonal festivals. The Japanese writing system also evolved with the development of kana, phonetic scripts derived from Chinese characters, which enabled the creation of uniquely Japanese literature. The most famous literary work of the period is The Tale of Genji, written by the noblewoman Murasaki Shikibu. Often considered the world's first novel, it provides a detailed glimpse into the lives, romances, and intrigues of the Heian aristocracy. Alongside this, works like Sei Shonagon's The Pillow Book captured daily life at court with wit and insight. Buddhism, which had entered Japan centuries earlier, became more deeply entrenched in society, influencing art, architecture, and philosophy. At the same time, native Shinto beliefs coexisted, blending into a syncretic religious culture. Grand temples and shrines were constructed, and religious rituals played an important role in court life. Despite the cultural brilliance of the capital, the imperial court gradually lost control over the provinces. Local warrior clans, or samurai, began to assert their power, especially as land ownership and military authority were increasingly decentralized. Conflicts between noble families escalated, and by the late Heian period, political power was contested by powerful warrior clans like the Taira and the Minamoto. This period culminated in the Jinpei War, a series of battles between these rival clans that ultimately ended in the fall of the Heian government. In 1185, the Minamoto clan emerged victorious, signaling the end of the Heian period and the beginning of a new era dominated by the samurai, the Kamakura Shogunate. While political power shifted, the cultural legacy of the Heian period would endure for centuries, shaping Japan's identity in literature, aesthetics, and spiritual life. Part 3. Feudal Japan. Kamakura Shogunate, 1185 to 1333. In the late 12th century, Japan underwent a profound transformation. Following decades of political turmoil and conflict between powerful warrior clans, the Minamoto clan emerged victorious over the Taira at the Battle of Dan no Ura in 1185. This decisive battle marked the end of the Genpei War and the beginning of a new era in Japanese governance. Minamoto no Yoritomo, the leader of the victorious clan, soon became the most powerful man in Japan. The triumph of Minamoto no Yoritomo was not just a military victory, it was a turning point in Japanese history. In 1192, Yoritomo was appointed Sei Taishogun, or Barbarian Subduing Generalissimo, by the emperor. This was not an honorary title. It signified the formal beginning of the Kamakura Shogunate, the first true military government in Japan. While the emperor remained a spiritual and cultural figurehead, the real political power was now in the hands of the shogun and his network of loyal warriors. The capital shifted from the elegant courtly environment of Kyoto to the austere coastal town of Kamakura, chosen by Yoritomo for its strategic defensibility and distance from the influence of the imperial aristocracy. The establishment of the Kamakura Shogunate fundamentally altered the structure of Japanese governance. Yoritomo introduced a system that relied heavily on feudal bonds of loyalty. Regional military governors, known as shugo, and land stewards, or jito, were appointed throughout the provinces. These figures were responsible for tax collection, law enforcement, and local military command. In exchange for their service, they were granted the right to collect income from lands. This marked the rise of a decentralized feudal system, where land and loyalty became the currency of power, and the warrior class, or samurai, became the dominant social force. Unlike the Heian aristocracy, who were steeped in poetry, calligraphy, and ritual, the new ruling class in Kamakura celebrated martial values, discipline, honor, self-sacrifice, and loyalty to one's lord. These ideals were not merely romantic. They were essential for survival in a world where political fortunes were often determined by the sword. Samurai were not only warriors, but also land managers, judges, and administrators, expected to uphold a code of conduct in both war and peace. This period laid the groundwork for what would later be idealized as Bushido, the way of the warrior. Religious life during the Kamakura period also saw profound changes. The established Buddhist schools of the capital, with their complex rituals and scholasticism, gave way to more accessible forms of faith that resonated with commoners and warriors alike. Pure Land Buddhism, emphasizing salvation through faith in the Amida Buddha, grew rapidly. So did Nichiren Buddhism, which preached exclusive devotion to the Lotus Sutra and often took a more confrontational stance. Meanwhile, Zen Buddhism, with its emphasis on meditation, simplicity, and direct personal insight, found a deep resonance with the samurai ethos. Many warriors found in Zen a spiritual practice that paralleled their own pursuit of discipline and mastery. The Kamakura period was not without its challenges. The Hojo clan, originally Yoritomo's in-laws, rose to power after his death and effectively ruled as regents, controlling the shogunate through a puppet shogun. This regency, known as the Hojo Bakufu, centralized power in Kamakura, but also sowed seeds of dissent. While the early Hojo leaders were able administrators, over time their rule became increasingly rigid and conservative, resistant to reform, and out of touch with growing unrest in the provinces. The greatest external threat to the Kamakura shogunate came from the Mongol Empire. In the 1260s, Kublai Khan, ruler of the most powerful empire on earth, sent emissaries to Japan demanding submission. The Japanese court, backed by the shogunate, refused. In response, Kublai launched two invasions, first in 1274 and again in 1281. The first invasion was limited in scale, but deadly. The Mongols brought new tactics, including coordinated infantry charges, iron projectiles, and explosive bombs, which shocked Japanese defenders used to more ritualized combat. However, a sudden typhoon struck, damaging the Mongol fleet and forcing a retreat. The second invasion was far larger and better prepared. Kublai Khan deployed two massive fleets, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers from Korea and China. The Japanese, anticipating the attack, had spent years fortifying their shores. For weeks, the samurai resisted the Mongol landing forces in brutal, close-quarter combat. Then, once again, nature intervened. Another typhoon, described in later chronicles as a kamikaze, or divine wind, obliterated much of the Mongol fleet. The surviving invaders were slaughtered or captured. The psychological impact of these victories was immense. The belief that Japan was divinely protected against foreign conquest became deeply embedded in national consciousness. But the cost of victory was high. The Mongol invasions bankrupted the Kamakura regime. Unlike internal wars, which resulted in new lands and wealth to redistribute to loyal samurai, The defense against the Mongols brought no spoils. The warriors who had risked their lives found themselves without reward, and dissatisfaction spread. The shogunate, already facing factionalism and intrigue within the Hojo Regency, struggled to maintain control. In the early 14th century, tensions between the military government and the imperial court resurfaced. Emperor Go-Daigo, ambitious and defiant, attempted to restore imperial rule. He rejected the shogunate's authority and secretly raised an army to challenge the Hojo. His first attempt failed, and he was exiled, but he escaped, regrouped, and gained the support of powerful samurai disillusioned with the Hojo, including the charismatic general Ashikaga Takauji. In 1333, with Takauji's help, Go-Daigo's forces captured Kamakura and destroyed the shogunate. The Hojo Regency was extinguished in a dramatic collapse, and for a brief time, imperial rule was restored in what is known as the Kenmu Restoration. But it was short-lived. The samurai class, having tasted real power for over a century, would not return to subservience. Within just a few years, Takauji himself turned against Go-Daigo and established a new shogunate, the Ashikaga Shogunate, plunging the country into a new phase of conflict and decentralization. The Kamakura period, though relatively brief in the grand scope of Japanese history, marked a permanent shift. It introduced a new political structure, empowered the warrior class, redefined the role of the emperor, and gave rise to cultural and religious movements that would shape Japanese identity for centuries. It was the dawn of samurai rule, a turning point that set Japan on a feudal path unlike any other nation in East Asia. Muromachi period, Ashikaga Shogunate, 1336 to 1573. The Muromachi period, spanning from 1336 to 1573, was a time of both cultural brilliance and political fragmentation in Japan. It began when Ashikaga Takauji, a former ally of the Kamakura Shogunate, turned against his superiors and seized power with the support of the imperial court. Takauji established the Ashikaga Shogunate and set up his headquarters in the Muromachi district of Kyoto, which gave the period its name. Unlike the Kamakura Shogunate, which ruled from a distance in eastern Japan, the Ashikaga shoguns governed from the heart of the imperial capital, making them more intertwined with the court life and aristocratic culture. However, their rule was often unstable, as they lacked the centralized control of their predecessors. Early in the period, a dispute over imperial succession resulted in the northern and southern courts, a time known as the Nanboku-cho period. From 1336 to 1392, rival emperors ruled simultaneously, one backed by the Ashikaga in Kyoto and another in the south at Yoshino. This split added to the fragmentation of power across Japan and was only resolved decades later when the southern court surrendered to the northern one, ending the dual monarchy. The most notable shogun of the Muromachi era was Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, who ruled in the late 14th century. Under his leadership, the shogunate reached its peak in terms of power and cultural achievement. He brokered peace between the rival courts, restored some order to the provinces, and opened formal trade relations with Ming China. Yoshimitsu's wealth and influence allowed him to sponsor major cultural projects, most famously the construction of the Golden Pavilion, or Kinkaku-ji, which still stands as a symbol of Kyoto's heritage. Despite these high points, the Ashikaga shogunate never achieved the same level of centralized authority as earlier or later regimes. Power was increasingly decentralized as provincial lords, or daimyo, grew more autonomous. The shogunate relied on alliances and compromises with these regional powers, which made it vulnerable to internal conflict. This weakness became glaringly apparent during the Onin War, a succession dispute that began in 1467 and spiraled into a nationwide civil war. Although the war officially ended in 1477, it marked the beginning of the Sengoku, or Warring States period, where central authority collapsed and military conflict engulfed the country for over a century. Culturally, the Muromachi period was a golden age. Zen Buddhism played a central role in shaping aesthetic values, influencing architecture, ink painting, gardening, and the tea ceremony. Simplicity, naturalism, and a sense of impermanence became hallmarks of Japanese culture during this time. No theater, with its stylized performance and deep philosophical themes, also took form in this period and continues to be performed to this day. Internationally, Japan began engaging in limited trade with China and other parts of Asia, though piracy from Japanese coasts, particularly by groups known as Waiko, was a persistent issue. The Ashikaga tried to regulate overseas activity, but their control was often undermined by powerful coastal lords pursuing their own interests. By the mid-16th century, as the Ashikaga shogunate grew weaker, ambitious daimyo rose to fill the power vacuum. Eventually, Ashikaga Yoshiaki, the 15th and final shogun, was deposed by Oda Nobunaga in 1573. With his ousting, the Muromachi period came to an end, and Japan moved into the final stage of the Sengoku era, setting the stage for national unification. The Muromachi period stands out in Japanese history as a complex era of artistic flourishing and political decentralization. It laid the cultural foundation for the aesthetic ideals Japan is known for today, even as it plunged the country into one of its most violent and chaotic centuries. Azuchi Momoyama period, 1573 to 1603. The Azuchi Momoyama period, spanning from 1573 to 1603, was a time of dramatic change, ruthless ambition, and the beginning of national unification in Japan. This era marks the closing chapter of the Sengoku, or Warring States period, a century-long time of chaos, constant warfare, and fractured rule. Emerging from this disarray were three extraordinary figures whose ambition and military prowess would shape the course of Japanese history: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Oda Nobunaga began the unification process with a bold and ruthless campaign to centralize power. A brilliant strategist, he was known for his innovative use of firearms and his willingness to break traditions in favor of efficiency and strength. Nobunaga crushed rival clans and Buddhist warrior monks who posed a threat to his control, including the destruction of the powerful Enryaku-ji temple. His rule was marked by both rapid modernization and violent suppression. His construction of Azuchi Castle symbolized a new era of authority and culture, a grand seat of power unlike anything Japan had seen before. However, Nobunaga's rise was cut short in 1582 when he was betrayed by his general Akechi Mitsuhide and forced to commit seppuku in the infamous incident at Honnoji. After Nobunaga's death, his most capable general, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, quickly avenged his master and rose to become the de facto ruler of Japan. Hideyoshi lacked noble birth, having started as a peasant, but through sheer talent and determination, he climbed to the top of the political and military ladder. He completed the unification of Japan, skillfully balancing force and diplomacy to bring remaining warlords under his control. He carried out major reforms: land surveys to determine taxation, the disarmament of peasants through the sword hunt, and restrictions that solidified the class hierarchy by binding samurai to their lords and forbidding social mobility. Hideyoshi also sought to elevate Japan's status on the world stage. In a bold and ultimately disastrous move, he launched two invasions of Korea in the 1590s, hoping to conquer the Korean peninsula and eventually China. Despite early successes, the campaigns overstretched Japan's resources and met fierce resistance from Korean and Ming Chinese forces. These invasions ended in failure, and Hideyoshi died in 1598, leaving behind a fragile legacy and a young son, Hideyori, who was too weak to maintain control. In the power vacuum that followed, Tokugawa Ieyasu, who had served under Nobunaga and maintained a careful alliance with Hideyoshi, emerged as the most powerful contender. His victory at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600 would end the Azuchi Momoyama period and usher in the Tokugawa Shogunate, a dynasty that would rule Japan for over 250 years. But in these few short decades, the Azuchi Momoyama period had transformed Japan from a fractured land of warlords into a centralized state poised to enter an age of peace, isolation, and cultural flourishing. It was a period of blood and ambition, but also of castles, art, and the birth of a unified Japan. Part 4. Edo Period, 1603 to 1868. Establishment of Tokugawa rule. When Tokugawa Ieyasu was officially appointed shogun in 1603, it marked the beginning of a transformative new era in Japanese history. The title solidified his authority as the military ruler of Japan, though in practice his control had already been secured following the decisive victory at the Battle of Sekigahara 3 years earlier. With this formal recognition, Ieyasu set in motion a long-term vision for national stability, social order, and dynastic continuity that would come to define the Tokugawa Shogunate and the Edo period, a span of over 250 years, characterized by peace, isolation, and cultural flourishing. From the very beginning of his rule, Ieyasu prioritized structure and control. He knew that military conquest alone could not preserve power indefinitely. The fragile unity of the nation, recently torn by a century of civil war, needed to be safeguarded by a system that discouraged rebellion, regulated power, and embedded loyalty to the shogunate within the very fabric of Japanese life. To this end, Ieyasu reorganized the country into domains ruled by daimyos, but these domains operated under strict oversight from Edo, the new capital. Each daimyo's land and income were carefully assessed, and their allegiance to the Tokugawa regime was constantly monitored. The most brilliant and burdensome of these policies was Sankin Kotai, the system of alternate attendance. Every daimyo was required to spend alternating years residing in Edo, leaving their family behind as virtual hostages when they returned to their home domains. This served several purposes. It drained the financial resources of the regional lords through constant travel and maintenance of too lavish households, and it prevented them from gathering military strength or forming conspiracies in isolation. As a result, a vast network of roads and post stations developed, linking even the most distant provinces to the political center. Over time, this infrastructure would have profound cultural and economic effects, connecting regions and facilitating trade in ways that further reinforced national unity. But Tokugawa control extended far beyond the daimyos. The social structure was deliberately frozen to prevent mobility and unrest. The four-tiered class system placed samurai at the top, followed by peasants, artisans, and merchants. Samurai were no longer battlefield warriors, but bureaucrats and enforcers of shogunal policy, living on stipends provided by their lords. Peasants, who made up the majority of the population, were tied to the land and tasked with feeding the country, while merchants, despite growing wealth in urban centers, were viewed with suspicion and assigned the lowest social status, as their income was seen as deriving from others' labor rather than their own. Religious control was also a key concern. Christianity, introduced by European missionaries in the previous century, was seen as a destabilizing foreign influence. The Tokugawa shogunate, wary of any allegiance that might rival loyalty to the shogun, cracked down brutally. Converts were hunted, tortured, and executed. Foreign missionaries were expelled, and practicing Christianity became a capital offense. The most dramatic demonstration of this policy came with the suppression of the Shimabara Rebellion, a Christian-led uprising that was crushed with overwhelming force. Afterward, the regime implemented even stricter anti-Christian measures and further solidified Japan's policy of national seclusion. The Sakoku policy, literally closed country, cut Japan off from most foreign contact for over 2 centuries. Only a small number of Dutch and Chinese merchants were permitted to trade under strict surveillance on the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki Bay. Foreign books, goods, and ideas were heavily censored, though the Dutch, who refrained from missionary activities, were allowed to bring limited scientific and technological knowledge through a field known as Rangaku, or Dutch learning. While Japan did not exist in total ignorance of the outside world, it maintained an extraordinary degree of self-imposed isolation, which preserved internal stability at the cost of global engagement. This long period of peace, often referred to as the Pax Tokugawa, enabled a flourishing of Japanese culture and society. With the absence of large-scale war, the focus turned inward. Cities grew in size and complexity. Edo itself became one of the largest urban centers in the world, its population sustained by a steady influx of goods, people, and ideas from across the country. Art and entertainment exploded in this environment. The merchant class, though officially low in status, fueled a growing consumer culture that supported kabuki theater, ukiyo-e woodblock prints, and a literary scene rich with satire, drama, and poetry. Even samurai, whose role had diminished in martial terms, began to find meaning in the arts and philosophy, contributing to the cultivation of Bushido, the moral code of the warrior, which emphasized honor, loyalty, and discipline. Education also advanced during the Tokugawa era. Domain schools for samurai were established across the country, promoting Confucian ethics and classical learning. In urban centers, temple schools, known as terrakoya, provided basic literacy and numeracy to children of commoners. As a result, literacy rates in Tokugawa Japan were among the highest in the world by the 18th century, laying the groundwork for Japan's later modernization. Though the shogunate was conservative by nature, this education fostered a population that was surprisingly well-informed and intellectually active. Still, beneath the surface of Tokugawa order were the seeds of eventual tension. The rigid social system, though stable, limited personal freedom and frustrated those at the lower rungs, especially merchants who grew wealthy but were denied status and political voice. Peasants bore heavy tax burdens, often to fund the increasingly elaborate lifestyles of the samurai and daimyos, and occasional famines and economic hardships sparked local uprisings. Meanwhile, some intellectuals began to question the Confucian orthodoxy promoted by the shogunate, exploring instead more empirical and critical forms of knowledge, especially through the influence of Dutch learning. Nonetheless, the Tokugawa system held firm for over 250 years. Through calculated policy, ruthless enforcement, and a vision of centralized control unprecedented in Japanese history, the Tokugawa shogunate transformed Japan from a fractured land of warlords into one of the most stable and culturally vibrant societies in the pre-modern world. It was not a utopia. Inequality, censorship, and harsh punishment were all tools of the state. But it was a remarkable period of internal cohesion and creative expression. The world outside would eventually come knocking, and Japan's isolation would be broken in the 19th century. But the legacy of the Tokugawa period would continue to shape Japanese identity long after the shogunate itself had fallen. Economic and cultural developments during the Edo period. Under the long and relatively peaceful reign of the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan underwent a series of profound economic and cultural transformations that redefined the character of Japanese society over more than 2.5 centuries. While the rigid class hierarchy and the policy of national seclusion created a closed and orderly society, these very constraints paradoxically fostered internal growth, innovation, and a flourishing of the arts that would leave a lasting mark on Japan's identity. One of the most significant economic transformations during this period was the transition from a primarily agrarian economy into a more complex market economy rooted in commerce, finance, and proto-industrial activity. Although rice remained the fundamental unit of economic value, used to measure wealth, taxation, and stipends, the increased commercialization of agriculture meant that farmers were producing not just for subsistence, but also for sale in expanding urban and regional markets. This shift enabled some farming communities to grow prosperous, creating new forms of rural wealth and social tension as traditional hierarchies were challenged by emerging economic realities. At the heart of the economic transformation was the rise of the merchant class. Officially considered low in the Confucian social order, below warriors, peasants, and artisans, merchants steadily amassed power through shrewd business practices, monopolistic guilds, and the expansion of domestic trade networks. These networks spanned the Japanese archipelago and included intricate systems of credit, remittance, and transport that enabled goods like sake, textiles, paper, oil, soy sauce, and timber to flow into urban centers. Osaka, often referred to as the kitchen of Japan, emerged as a key economic hub, functioning as the nation's central clearinghouse for rice and commodities. Edo, modern-day Tokyo, the seat of the shogunate, also saw explosive urban growth, becoming one of the largest cities in the world by the 18th century. Financial institutions became increasingly sophisticated during this period. Money lending, banking, and the use of promissory notes became widespread, especially among merchants who extended credit to samurai, many of whom lived beyond their means and had to borrow heavily to maintain their status and lifestyle. This reversal of economic power, where the samurai were indebted to the merchant class, was one of the more striking ironies of the period. It subtly undermined the ideological foundations of the Tokugawa order, which prized hereditary status over economic achievement. Alongside these economic changes, a distinct and highly sophisticated urban culture blossomed. As cities like Edo, Kyoto, and Osaka grew, so too did a shared public culture centered around entertainment, fashion, leisure, and the arts. The pleasure quarters, most famously Yoshiwara in Edo, were vibrant zones of social and artistic experimentation. Though officially regulated and morally ambiguous, these districts became crucibles of creativity, where poets, artists, actors, musicians, and courtesans mingled with merchants and samurai. The term ukiyo, or floating world, came to define this hedonistic, transient lifestyle. The artistic output of the floating world was as prolific as it was influential. Ukiyo-e woodblock prints depicted not only the sensuous beauty of courtesans and actors, but also landscapes, folk tales, and scenes of daily life. Artists like Hokusai and Hiroshige elevated the form into a sophisticated visual language that later captivated European impressionists in the 19th century. These prints were mass-produced and widely circulated, making art accessible to the emerging urban middle class and solidifying a shared visual culture across regions. Theater also underwent a golden age. Kabuki, initially a raucous and unsanctioned form of popular entertainment, matured into a highly stylized dramatic tradition characterized by exaggerated movement, vivid costumes, and intricate plots blending historical events with contemporary concerns. Unlike the aristocratic No theater, Kabuki was aimed at commoners and reflected their tastes, aspirations, and frustrations. Simultaneously, Bunraku, Japan's puppet theater, achieved remarkable narrative depth and emotional resonance, aided by the collaborative work of playwright Chikamatsu Monzaemon, often dubbed the Shakespeare of Japan. Literature diversified and flourished, responding to the sensibilities of a new reading public. Ihara Saikaku chronicled the lives of merchants, pleasure seekers, and rogues with wit and realism, moving away from the courtly elegance of earlier periods. Meanwhile, the poetic form of haiku, refined by Matsuo Basho, embodied a minimalist aesthetic rooted in Zen sensibility. Basho's travel diaries, such as The Narrow Road to the Deep North, fused poetry and prose, solitude and nature, evoking the spiritual and emotional landscape of Edo period Japan with unmatched subtlety. Education expanded beyond the traditional samurai elite. Temple schools, terrakoya, and private academies provided basic literacy and numeracy to the children of townspeople and peasants. Literacy rates in Japan during the late Edo period were among the highest in the world, particularly in urban areas. This widespread education helped create an informed public capable of participating in and contributing to the vibrant cultural sphere. Despite Japan's official isolation, intellectual currents from abroad still found their way in through tightly regulated contact with the Dutch at Dejima. This gave rise to Rangaku, or Dutch learning, which encompassed Western studies in medicine, astronomy, physics, and geography. Japanese scholars translated European texts and conducted their own experiments, integrating this new knowledge into traditional frameworks. Rangaku served as a quiet but persistent reminder that Japan was not entirely cut off from the broader world, and that modernity was always waiting at the edges of its insular order. Yet beneath this flowering of culture and wealth, contradictions brewed. The samurai, while still ideologically central, were often impoverished and discontent. The merchants, though prosperous, remained officially marginalized. The bakufu, shogunate, struggled to control inflation, regulate commerce, and suppress peasant uprisings, which occasionally flared in response to tax burdens and natural disasters. Famines, like the Great Tenmei Famine, revealed the fragility of the social order and the limits of centralized governance. By the 19th century, these contradictions became increasingly difficult to ignore. Economic power had shifted. Social mobility, though unofficial, had become a reality, and cultural energy was pulsing through the cities in ways that no edict could fully contain. The very mechanisms that had ensured stability and peace were now obstacles to adaptation. When foreign ships appeared on the horizon in the mid-19th centuries, they did not simply threaten Japan's borders. They threatened an entire worldview, one that had cultivated unparalleled cultural richness, yet had also resisted structural reform for too long. These economic and cultural transformations laid the groundwork for Japan's eventual modernization. They demonstrated the Japanese people's capacity for innovation, adaptation, and creativity, qualities that would soon be tested in ways no one within the floating world could yet imagine. Western encounters during the Edo period. By the early 19th century, the illusion of invulnerability began to waver. Western powers, driven by imperial ambitions and industrial economies, had begun carving up Asia. China, Japan's powerful continental neighbor, suffered a humiliating defeat in the First Opium War against Britain, resulting in the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. Japan watched with alarm as the Qing dynasty, long viewed with a mixture of reverence and rivalry, was forced to cede Hong Kong, pay vast reparations, and allow foreign merchants to operate in its cities. The message was clear: isolation could no longer guarantee safety. Meanwhile, foreign ships began appearing more frequently in Japanese waters. American whalers sought safe harbors, European navies demanded fuel and supplies, and occasional shipwrecked sailors asked for help. Each arrival triggered confusion and debate among Japanese officials. The shogunate's rigid policies allowed little room for negotiation, but the presence of foreign vessels, some with cannons and iron hulls, was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore or repel. The turning point came in July 1853. On a hazy summer day, 4 black-hulled steamships sailed into Edo Bay, their engines hissing and their American flags fluttering in the wind. At their helm was Commodore Matthew Perry, a veteran of the U.S. Navy who had been tasked with opening Japan to the outside world. The sight of Perry's fleet caused a sensation. Villagers gathered along the shores, local officials panicked, and Edo was thrown into turmoil. The Japanese had never seen steamships before, and they dubbed them Kurofune, or black ships, both for their appearance and the threat they represented. Perry came not as a supplicant, but as a messenger of American strength. He presented a letter from U.S. President Millard Fillmore, requesting that Japan open its ports for trade, assist shipwrecked sailors, and permit the establishment of diplomatic relations. Perry's posture was unapologetically assertive. He made it clear that if Japan refused, the United States would return, with greater force if necessary. After delivering the letter, he withdrew his ships but vowed to return for an answer. This encounter forced the Tokugawa Shogunate into an impossible dilemma. Militarily, Japan could not match the firepower of the American fleet, but diplomatically, accepting foreign demands was seen by many as capitulation, an intolerable humiliation for a proud and autonomous civilization. For months, debate raged within the highest echelons of government. Some argued for resistance at all costs. Others, particularly those exposed to Dutch learning or aware of China's fate, urged negotiation to buy time. Perry returned in early 1854 with an even larger fleet. This time, after tense negotiations, the shogunate agreed to sign the Treaty of Kanagawa. The treaty opened the ports of Shimoda and Hakodate to American ships, guaranteed the humane treatment of shipwrecked sailors, and allowed the establishment of a permanent U.S. consul. Though modest in scope, the treaty shattered the Sakoku policy that had defined Japan for over 200 years. The impact was immediate and profound. Within a few years, similar treaties were signed with Britain, Russia, France, and the Netherlands. These so-called unequal treaties granted foreign nationals extraterritorial rights, exempting them from Japanese law, and imposed fixed low import tariffs that Japan had no power to change. These humiliating terms mirrored the treaties imposed on China and served as a constant reminder of Japan's vulnerable position in the world. Beyond legal implications, the psychological effect of these Western encounters was enormous. Japan, long confident in its cultural superiority and internal harmony, was forced to confront the unsettling reality of its technological and military inferiority. The black ships had pierced not only Japan's coastal defenses, but its world view. The very legitimacy of the Tokugawa regime, which had staked its authority on maintaining peace and order, was now in question. Dissatisfaction grew, not just among the elite, but across domains. Young samurai, particularly from the southwestern regions of Choshu and Satsuma, were incensed by the shogunate's perceived cowardice. They began to rally around the emperor, whose symbolic authority had been largely ceremonial during Tokugawa rule. "Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians," became a rallying cry. Others, however, saw in the Western powers a model to emulate, not culturally, but technologically. They believed that only by mastering the industrial and military tools of the West could Japan preserve its sovereignty. Thus, the Western encounters did more than open a few ports. They destabilized a centuries-old political order, ignited intellectual and ideological movements, and planted the seeds of revolution. Within 15 years of Perry's arrival, the Tokugawa Shogunate would collapse, and Japan would enter a new era, one defined by rapid modernization, military reform, and global ambition. The encounter with the West had not simply changed Japan's policies, it had changed Japan itself. Part 5. Modern Japan. Meiji Restoration, 1868 to 1912. In 1868, Japan experienced a seismic shift that would redefine its place in the world. The Meiji Restoration, as it came to be known, was not just a change in political leadership. It was a comprehensive revolution that altered the very fabric of Japanese society, government, economy, and international outlook. It began when the Tokugawa Shogunate, which had ruled Japan for over 2.5 centuries, collapsed under the weight of both internal strife and external pressures. Power was formally returned to the emperor, a figure who had long held symbolic authority but little actual control. This restoration of imperial rule was more than ceremonial. It was the start of Japan's aggressive campaign to modernize and avoid the fate that had befallen other Asian nations colonized by Western powers. The leaders of the new government, many of whom were former samurai from powerful domains like Satsuma and Choshu, understood that the world had changed. In the face of gunboat diplomacy and imperial aggression from Western nations, Japan could no longer afford to cling to its feudal past. They believed that survival meant transformation, and they pursued change with remarkable determination and speed. The Meiji government began by dismantling the rigid class structure that had defined Japanese life for centuries. The samurai, once privileged warriors and bureaucrats, lost their stipends, their right to carry swords in public, and their hereditary status. This was not a peaceful process. Many samurai felt betrayed and revolted, the most famous of these uprisings being the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877, led by Saigo Takamori, a former Meiji official turned rebel. But the rebellion was crushed by the new conscript army, a Western-style military force recruited from commoners. This marked a dramatic shift in social order and symbolized the death of the samurai era. Japan's feudal domains, or Han, were also abolished and replaced with centrally governed prefectures. Daimyo lords who once ruled these regions were forced to relinquish their lands and authority to the state. In return, they were offered noble titles and salaries, ensuring their cooperation while eliminating their power. The country was now governed from a centralized bureaucracy based in Tokyo, formerly Edo, and controlled by ministries that managed education, finance, the military, and internal affairs. To understand how to remake the country, the Meiji leaders launched the Iwakura mission in 1871. This high-level diplomatic journey around the world lasted nearly 2 years and included stops in the United States, Britain, France, Germany, and other nations. The delegates observed Western industrial plants, schools, military academies, parliaments, and legal systems. What they learned abroad profoundly influenced the domestic reforms that followed. One of the most visible and symbolic changes was the adoption of Western customs. Japanese men in the government and elite classes began wearing Western suits and top hats. The imperial court adopted European court protocols. The calendar was reformed to align with the Gregorian system. Railroads, telegraph lines, and modern postal systems were introduced. Cities became more Western in layout and function. The streets of Tokyo began to resemble those of European capitals, at least superficially. Beneath the surface, the Meiji government was laying the foundations for a modern industrial state. It nationalized many industries in the early years, and later privatized them to accelerate growth. Enterprises like mining, textiles, shipbuilding, and steel production were heavily supported by the state. This gave rise to powerful business conglomerates known as zaibatsu, companies like Mitsubishi and Mitsui that became the engines of the Japanese economy. The government also created banks, stock exchanges, and a modern tax system based on land ownership, providing stable revenue for infrastructure projects. A modern education system was introduced, modeled on Western systems, but with distinct Japanese characteristics. Education was made compulsory for boys and girls, with a strong emphasis on literacy, moral education, and loyalty to the emperor. Universities like the University of Tokyo were established to produce future bureaucrats, scientists, engineers, and teachers who would lead the nation into a new era. In 1889, the Meiji Constitution was promulgated, establishing Japan as a constitutional monarchy. While real power still resided with the emperor and his advisors, the creation of the Imperial Diet, a legislative body with a House of Representatives and a House of Peers, was a step toward representative government. The document also enshrined civil rights, though in practice these were limited. The emperor was portrayed as the divine and infallible leader of the nation, a symbol of unity, and the embodiment of national identity. Foreign policy during the Meiji era was marked by an assertive nationalism. Determined to renegotiate the unequal treaties that had been forced on Japan by Western powers in the 1850s, the Meiji government realized it needed to demonstrate that Japan was the equal of Western nations in every way. This goal was partially achieved by the end of the 19th century, but not before Japan had to prove itself on the battlefield. In 1894, Japan went to war with China over influence in Korea. The First Sino-Japanese War ended in a decisive Japanese victory, and China ceded Taiwan and the Liaodong Peninsula to Japan. Although Western powers forced Japan to return the peninsula in what was known as the Triple Intervention, Japan's prestige had grown. A decade later, Japan would face an even greater challenge, the Russian Empire. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 was a major test of Japan's modernization efforts. Against all expectations, Japan defeated Russia, shocking the world and signaling the arrival of a new great power. For the first time in the modern era, an Asian nation had defeated a European empire in a major war. The victory earned Japan control over Port Arthur, southern Manchuria, and greater influence in Korea, which it would annex in 1910. Culturally, the Meiji period was a time of immense change and sometimes confusion. Traditional arts like woodblock printing, tea ceremony, and kabuki theater coexisted uneasily with Western novels, operas, and scientific rationalism. Philosophers and intellectuals debated what it meant to be modern and Japanese at the same time. Some feared the loss of identity, while others saw in the fusion of East and West the potential for a new kind of civilization. By the end of Emperor Meiji's reign in 1912, Japan had transformed from a secluded island nation into an industrialized imperial power with a modern military, a growing empire, and a population increasingly educated and nationalistic. The transformation was so rapid and so total that it became a model for other nations hoping to resist Western dominance. But the success of the Meiji era came with its own contradictions and consequences: imperial ambition, cultural upheaval, and an identity forged through imitation and innovation. These forces would continue to shape Japan in the decades to come, for better and for worse. Taisho Period, 1912 to 1926. The Taisho period, which lasted from 1912 to 1926, occupies a unique and often overlooked chapter in Japan's history, bridging the profound transformations of the Meiji era and the militarism of the early Showa period. Though only spanning 14 years, it was a time of tremendous social dynamism, political experimentation, cultural modernization, and subtle tension beneath the surface. The era began with the death of Emperor Meiji and the accession of his son, Emperor Taisho, whose personal health issues, primarily neurological, rendered him increasingly unable to rule effectively. This absence of a strong figurehead created a rare political vacuum at the imperial level, opening the way for democratic tendencies to emerge in the space left behind. What followed was a time often referred to as Taisho democracy. While the phrase is somewhat idealized, it captures the essence of the political shifts that occurred. Power increasingly shifted from the military and the Junro, elder statesmen, toward the Diet and emerging political parties. The formation of cabinets led by party leaders rather than appointed elites marked a major shift. Prime ministers like Hara Takashi, Japan's first commoner to lead the government, signaled a departure from hereditary aristocracy and toward broader political representation. Under his leadership, the Seiyukai Party pursued policies to expand infrastructure and education, aiming to stabilize Japan's internal development. A landmark moment came in 1925 when universal male suffrage was enacted, giving the vote to all men over the age of 25, regardless of property ownership. This was a massive leap forward in Japan's democratic development, symbolizing a government more accountable to the people than ever before. However, this advancement came with a dark underside. The same year saw the passage of the Peace Preservation Law, which severely restricted freedom of speech and cracked down on leftist ideologies, especially communism and socialism. This duality, freedom expanding in one hand while being curtailed in another, typified the contradictions of the Taisho period. Economically, Japan experienced both boom and bust. The First World War, 1914 to 1918, proved to be an economic windfall for Japan. As European powers became consumed with the war, Japan filled the vacuum in Asia's export markets. Japanese industry surged, with textiles, shipbuilding, and heavy manufacturing experiencing unprecedented growth. However, this wartime prosperity proved unsustainable. After the war ended, European competition returned, and the Japanese economy faltered. Speculation, overproduction, and weak financial regulation contributed to a fragile financial system. This fragility became painfully clear in the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake, a catastrophe that leveled large portions of Tokyo and Yokohama, killing over 100,000 people and leaving millions homeless. In the chaos that followed, racial scapegoating erupted. Rumors that Korean immigrants had poisoned wells and started fires led to widespread mob violence. Thousands of ethnic Koreans, Chinese residents, and even Japanese mistaken for foreigners were brutally murdered. This eruption of ethnic violence shocked the nation and revealed the undercurrent of xenophobia that had begun to develop as nationalism grew. Despite this, the urban middle class continued to grow, bringing with it a vibrant and modernizing popular culture. This was the age of the moga and mobo, modern girls and modern boys, young urbanites who embraced Western fashion, jazz music, dance halls, and cinemas. Consumer culture flourished. Department stores, cafes, and theaters sprang up in Japan's cities, and a new mass media emerged. Newspapers, magazines, and pulp novels fed the public's hunger for information and entertainment. Japanese literature also blossomed during this time, with writers like Akutagawa Ryunosuke and Tanizaki Junichiro exploring themes of modernity, alienation, and the tension between tradition and change. Japan's intellectual life similarly experienced a surge in vitality. Universities expanded, and more people, especially in cities, were exposed to ideas like liberalism, socialism, and feminism. Women began entering higher education in increasing numbers, and early feminists such as Hiratsuka Raicho began organizing and publishing works that advocated for women's political and economic rights. The 1911 founding of the literary magazine Seito, Blue Stocking, marked the emergence of modern Japanese feminism. These movements were small and often marginalized, but they laid critical groundwork for future social reforms. Internationally, Japan's status as an imperial power was cemented during the Taisho period. In World War I, Japan sided with the Allies and used the opportunity to seize German-controlled territories in China and the Pacific. In 1915, Japan issued the infamous 21 demands to China, attempting to extend its dominance over the country. Although the demands were scaled back under international pressure, they reflected Japan's growing appetite for regional control. At the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, Japan sat among the victorious powers and gained control of former German colonies in the Pacific. However, when Japan proposed including a racial equality clause in the League of Nations Charter, it was rejected, largely due to opposition from Britain and the United States. The rejection was a turning point in Japan's view of the West, sowing seeds of resentment that would later influence its foreign policy. Toward the end of the Taisho period, the social optimism and political experimentation that had characterized the earlier years began to give way to uncertainty. Economic instability, rural poverty, rising labor unrest, and political corruption all contributed to a growing sense of disillusionment. The financial sector was rocked by bank failures and a stock market crash in 1927, just after the Taisho era ended. Nationalist sentiments, once a fringe reaction, began to gain traction as people yearned for stability and purpose. In sum, the Taisho period was a brief but deeply formative chapter in Japan's journey toward modernity. It was an era where democracy flirted with real power, where urban culture flourished, and where Japan sought its place in a new global order. But it was also a time when repression lurked behind reform, and when the seeds of future authoritarianism and militarism were quietly taking root. The legacy of Taisho is one of paradox, a hopeful moment that promised much, delivered some, and left many of its dreams unrealized as the nation moved into a more turbulent future. Showa Period, pre-World War II, 1926 to 1945. The Showa era began in 1926 with the enthronement of Emperor Hirohito, whose reign would become the longest in Japanese history and one of the most dramatic. His ascension marked a symbolic shift in Japan's national consciousness. A generation had passed since the Meiji Restoration, and the country had undergone rapid modernization. Yet beneath the veneer of industrial progress and growing urban sophistication, tensions were building that would soon erupt onto the national and international stage. In the years immediately following World War I, Japan had emerged as a rising imperial power. It had seized former German colonies in the Pacific and Shandong in China, and participated in the founding of the League of Nations as one of its principal members. Yet, despite these accomplishments, Japan's position on the world stage remained precarious. The Washington Naval Conference of 1921 to 1922, which sought to limit naval armaments among the major powers, imposed constraints on Japan's fleet size relative to the United States and Britain. Many in Japan viewed these limitations as discriminatory and humiliating. This sentiment fueled nationalist resentment, and a belief among many that Japan's destiny would never be respected by Western powers unless it acted unilaterally and assertively. Meanwhile, at home, the 1920s were marked by political instability and growing disillusionment with parliamentary democracy. The Taisho era had seen the emergence of political parties and some liberal reforms, but by the late 1920s, cracks in this system were becoming apparent. Japan's economy, heavily reliant on exports, was hit hard by the global Great Depression beginning in 1929. Silk, Japan's major export, saw prices plummet by over 50%. Rural communities were devastated, with some families so impoverished that they sold daughters into servitude. In the cities, unemployment soared and the lower classes became increasingly radicalized. This economic desperation provided fertile ground for the rise of militarism and the appeal of nationalistic rhetoric that promised revival and renewal through strength. It was during this climate of crisis that the Japanese military began to assert greater control over national policy. The army, long revered for its role in the Meiji Restoration, had grown increasingly independent of civilian oversight. It had its own budget, its own networks of influence, and a deep ideological belief in Japan's imperial mission. In 1931, a group of mid-ranking officers from the Kwantung Army staged the Mukden Incident, a fabricated attack on a Japanese-owned railway in Manchuria, which they used as a pretext to launch a full-scale invasion. Without authorization from Tokyo, the military quickly took over Manchuria, facing little effective resistance from Chinese forces. The civilian government was caught off guard, and, fearing public backlash and military insubordination, retroactively approved the action. In 1932, the puppet state of Manchukuo was established, with the last Qing emperor, Puyi, installed as its nominal head of state. The League of Nations condemned the invasion, prompting Japan to withdraw from the organization in 1933. This marked a decisive turn toward international isolation, and a clear signal that Japan would henceforth pursue its interests without regard for international consensus or diplomacy. Political violence became more common in the early 1930s. Radical nationalist groups and military factions carried out a series of assassinations of moderate politicians and business leaders whom they viewed as corrupt or insufficiently patriotic. The most notable was the May 15th incident in 1932, in which naval officers assassinated Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi. Although the assassins were lightly punished, garnering widespread public sympathy, it sent a chilling message to other politicians: oppose the military at your own risk. The following years saw the increasing militarization of Japanese society. Education was restructured to emphasize loyalty to the emperor, traditional values, and national sacrifice. The press was censored, dissenting voices were silenced, industrial policy was reorganized around the needs of the state, and the economy began to orient itself toward war production. The rise of ideologies like the Showa Restoration sought to return power to the emperor and purge Western influences, combining reverence for tradition with a call for national rebirth through military strength. In 1937, war with China broke out again following the Marco Polo Bridge incident. This escalated rapidly into the Second Sino-Japanese War, a brutal and prolonged conflict that would last until the end of World War II. The early stages of the war saw swift Japanese advances and the capture of key cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing. But the war also unleashed unspeakable horrors. In Nanjing, Japanese troops committed a massacre that lasted for weeks. Tens, possibly hundreds of thousands of civilians and prisoners of war were killed, and mass rapes were perpetrated. Known as the Nanjing Massacre, or Rape of Nanjing, it shocked the world and cemented Japan's reputation as an aggressor. Despite capturing large parts of eastern China, Japan found itself bogged down in a guerrilla war it could not easily win. Chinese resistance under both the nationalists and communists remained strong. Meanwhile, the war placed an enormous burden on Japan's economy and military, requiring ever greater mobilization and sacrificing civilian needs for the sake of victory. Japan's solution was to expand further, seeking the resources of Southeast Asia and the Pacific to sustain its war machine. In 1940, Japan joined the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, solidifying its role as part of the Axis powers. This alliance was intended as a deterrent against American and British interference. The same year, Japan moved into French Indochina, taking advantage of France's collapse in Europe. These aggressive moves heightened tensions with the United States, which had been growing increasingly concerned about Japan's expansionist ambitions and its alliance with fascist regimes. American responses included trade restrictions, most notably an oil embargo imposed in 1941. For Japan, which imported the vast majority of its oil, this was a potentially crippling blow. Yet, instead of backing down, Japan's leaders, dominated by military figures, concluded that war was inevitable. Their solution was a preemptive strike to secure Southeast Asia and the Pacific before the United States could fully mobilize. As Japan prepared for this bold move, it continued to present itself as a liberator of Asia from Western colonialism, promoting the idea of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. But behind the propaganda lay a hard reality. Japan's rule in occupied territories was often harsh and exploitative, driven by the needs of its war effort. By the end of 1941, Japan was poised to launch a massive military campaign across the Pacific, beginning with the attack on Pearl Harbor. But that chapter belongs to the next era. What began in 1926 as a time of promise and transition had transformed within less than 2 decades into a militarized state committed to conquest, shaped by an ideology of racial superiority, imperial destiny, and divine mission. The seeds of global conflict had taken root in the soil of economic hardship, political violence, and ideological extremism, and the world would soon feel their devastating fruits. Part 6. Post-war to present, 1945 to now. American occupation, 1945 to 1952. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, the country entered one of the most dramatic and consequential periods in its entire history, the American occupation, which lasted until 1952. This period marked a profound turning point, a complete reimagining of what Japan was and what it could become. It was the first time Japan had ever been occupied by a foreign power, and rather than being reduced to a subjugated colony, the country became the testing ground for one of the most ambitious social and political transformations in modern history. This transformation would take Japan from a shattered empire to a peaceful democracy within just a few years. At the head of the occupation was General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers. While officially under the authority of the Allied nations, in practice, the occupation was overwhelmingly directed by the United States and reflected American ideals and strategic goals. MacArthur's task was nothing less than the reconstruction of a defeated nation, physically, economically, and ideologically. The immediate concerns in post-war Japan were humanitarian. Cities had been devastated by Allied bombings. Millions were homeless. Infrastructure was in ruins. There were acute shortages of food, fuel, and medicine. Inflation was out of control. The black market thrived as people struggled to survive. The situation was especially dire in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where atomic bombs had obliterated entire communities and left survivors facing both physical and psychological trauma. Starvation was a genuine threat in the winter of 1945 to 1946, and relief shipments from the United States were critical in preventing mass death. With basic survival stabilized, the occupation authorities turned toward structural reform. Their goals were threefold: to demilitarize, democratize, and decentralize Japan. Demilitarization began immediately. The Japanese Imperial Army and Navy were dismantled. War industries were repurposed or shut down entirely. Thousands of military officials, industrialists, and politicians were purged from public life. War crime tribunals were convened in Tokyo to hold leaders accountable for Japan's aggression in World War II. 25 Class A war criminals were tried, and 7, including Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, were executed. The trials were both controversial and symbolic. They signaled the end of militarism and the beginning of accountability. Perhaps the most revolutionary reform was the new constitution, which replaced the Meiji Constitution of 1889. Drafted in a matter of weeks in early 1946 by a team of American legal experts, the new constitution was presented as a Japanese initiative, but bore unmistakable marks of its foreign authorship. It came into force in 1947 and remains in effect to this day. The Constitution was a radical document. It declared the sovereignty of the people, not the emperor. It guaranteed fundamental human rights, including freedom of speech, religion, assembly, and the press. Women were granted full political rights, including the right to vote, hold office, and equal protection under the law. Labor rights were enshrined. Education was made a right and a duty. The document also introduced a bicameral legislature and an independent judiciary. The most famous and controversial part of the Constitution was Article 9, in which Japan renounced war as a sovereign right and pledged never to maintain land, sea, or air forces capable of warfare. Though Japan would later establish the self-defense forces, this clause symbolized a profound national commitment to peace and has remained a central feature of Japanese identity and debate. Another major reform was the redefinition of the emperor's role. Hirohito was allowed to remain on the throne, but his divinity was renounced. The emperor became a symbol of the state and of the unity of the people, with no governing power. This move preserved continuity for the Japanese people, many of whom revered the emperor while removing him as a source of political authority. Land reform was another transformative policy. Prior to the war, much of Japan's farmland was owned by wealthy landlords who rented it to tenant farmers. Under the occupation, millions of acres were purchased by the government and sold to the farmers who actually worked the land. This not only redistributed economic power, but also helped to reduce rural poverty and increase agricultural productivity. It also weakened one of the traditional bases of conservatism and hierarchy in Japanese society. Women's rights underwent a seismic shift. Under the old order, women had few legal protections and were largely confined to the domestic sphere. Under the new constitution, women gained the right to vote, to own property, and to seek employment. In the 1946 general elections, Japanese women voted for the first time, and several were elected to the new parliament. Schools began to offer equal education to boys and girls, laying the foundation for generations of women to play a more active role in society. The education system was overhauled to reflect democratic values. The ultranationalist curriculum that had dominated pre-war education was scrapped. New textbooks were written, emphasizing critical thinking, civic responsibility, and human rights. The school structure was modeled after the American system, with 6 years of elementary, 3 years of junior high, and 3 years of high school. University reforms encouraged academic freedom and research. Censorship, ironically, was also a part of the democratization process. Occupation authorities suppressed militarist propaganda, ultranationalist writing, and any material that could undermine the occupation's goals. At the same time, they promoted media that supported democracy, peace, and cooperation with the Allies. This sometimes led to awkward contradictions. Freedom of the press was enshrined, yet tightly controlled during the occupation itself. On the economic front, Japan faced immense challenges. Its economy was shattered, its infrastructure in ruins, and inflation rampant. The initial occupation policy aimed at breaking up the zaibatsu, the huge industrial conglomerates that had helped fuel Japan's war machine. Some were dissolved, and new antitrust laws were enacted. The goal was to decentralize economic power and promote a more competitive, consumer-driven economy. However, the rise of the Cold War soon shifted U.S. priorities. As communist movements gained strength in China and Korea, the U.S. became increasingly concerned with stabilizing Japan as a bulwark against communism in Asia. The reverse course began around 1947 to 1948. Instead of pushing radical reforms, occupation policy began to emphasize economic recovery, political stability, and containment of leftist movements. Many purged officials were quietly reinstated. Labor unions were reined in. The U.S. began funding Japan's industrial revival, especially during the Korean War, which turned Japan into a vital supplier of materials and logistics for the American military. This pivot helped launch Japan's post-war economic recovery. By the early 1950s, the Japanese economy was beginning to rebound. Industrial production increased, exports resumed, and infrastructure was rebuilt. Though Japan was still far from the economic powerhouse it would become, the foundation for its economic miracle in the 1960s and beyond was being laid. The occupation officially ended with the signing of the San Francisco Peace Treaty in 1951, which came into effect on April 28, 1952. Japan regained its sovereignty, though it remained under the security umbrella of the United States. A separate U.S.-Japan security treaty allowed the continued presence of American military bases in Japan, a controversial arrangement that persists to this day. By the end of the occupation, Japan had changed almost beyond recognition. It had gone from a militarist empire to a pacifist democracy, from a rigidly hierarchical society to a more egalitarian one, from a devastated economy to the brink of rebirth. The legacy of the occupation is complex. Some see it as a benevolent reform effort, others as a strategic imposition of American power. But what's undeniable is that this 7-year period redefined Japan's path for the rest of the 20th century and continues to shape its society, politics, and identity even now. Economic miracle, 1950s to 1980s. After the devastation of World War II, Japan's economy lay in ruins. Cities were flattened, industries dismantled, and the country was under U.S. occupation. Yet, within just a few decades, Japan would rise to become the second largest economy in the world, behind only the United States. This extraordinary transformation is known as the Japanese economic miracle, a period of rapid industrialization, innovation, and global economic influence from the 1950s through the 1980s. The miracle didn't happen overnight. It began with a foundation laid during the U.S. occupation from 1945 to 1952, led by General Douglas MacArthur. The American occupation authorities introduced sweeping reforms to rebuild and democratize Japan. Feudal remnants were removed, land reforms broke the power of wealthy landlords, and redistributed farmland to tenant farmers, greatly improving rural stability and productivity. Labor laws were passed, allowing unions to form. Women gained the right to vote. A new constitution was drafted, renouncing war and promoting pacifism. Another major change was the breakup of the zaibatsu, massive industrial conglomerates that had dominated the pre-war economy and were seen as partly responsible for fueling Japan's militarism. These were dismantled or restructured into smaller corporate groups called keiretsu, which would later evolve into complex networks of interlinked firms, banks, and suppliers. The real takeoff came with the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950. Although Japan was not a combatant, it became a crucial logistics and manufacturing hub for U.S. forces fighting on the Korean peninsula. American orders for uniforms, vehicles, medical supplies, and machinery poured into Japan, injecting vast sums of money into its paralyzed economy. This special procurement demand is often referred to as a gift from the gods by Japanese economists. It jump-started industrial recovery and gave Japanese firms the capital and experience they needed to rebuild and expand. In the years that followed, Japan experienced breathtaking growth. From the mid-1950s to the early 1970s, its economy grew at an average annual rate of nearly 10%, earning it comparisons to post-war West Germany. This was not just recovery, it was reinvention. The Japanese government played an active role, with economic policy steered by a powerful Ministry of International Trade and Industry. Unlike many Western economies that leaned heavily on market forces, Japan practiced what's often called state-guided capitalism. Ministry of International Trade and Industry identified key sectors to promote: steel, shipbuilding, machinery, automobiles, and eventually electronics, and provided them with subsidies, tax incentives, and low-interest loans. It also managed foreign exchange and tightly regulated imports to protect fledgling domestic industries until they were ready to compete globally. The government worked closely with private firms, banks, and research institutes in a spirit of national cooperation that prioritized long-term strategic planning over short-term profit. Japanese businesses embraced a distinctive philosophy of management and labor relations. One of the most iconic elements was the concept of lifetime employment at large corporations. Workers who joined a company were often expected to remain there until retirement, and in return, they were promised job security, benefits, and gradual wage increases based on seniority. This fostered loyalty, stability, and a company-first mindset that encouraged continuous improvement, or kaizen, a practice where employees at all levels were empowered to suggest and implement small, incremental improvements. Japanese manufacturers became synonymous with quality. Techniques like total quality control, TQC, just-in-time inventory management, and lean manufacturing were perfected and widely adopted. These innovations minimized waste, reduced costs, and ensured reliability. In an era when "Made in Japan" was once a mark of inferiority, it soon became a global badge of excellence. By the 1960s, Japan was not only catching up to the West, it was beginning to surpass it in key industries. Steel production surged. Japan became the world's largest shipbuilder. Its camera manufacturers, Nikon, Canon, Olympus, dominated the global market. But it was the automotive industry that truly captured the world's attention. Toyota, Honda, Nissan, and Mazda rolled out vehicles that were affordable, fuel-efficient, and highly reliable. While Detroit produced gas-guzzling giants, Japan was making compact cars that aligned perfectly with the needs of the emerging global middle class. The electronics revolution followed suit. Sony, Panasonic, then known as Matsushita, Toshiba, and Sharp led the charge with cutting-edge consumer technology: radios, televisions, cassette players, and the iconic Walkman. Japanese products flooded markets in the United States, Europe, and across Asia. By the end of the 1970s, Japan had established itself as a technological and industrial powerhouse. The oil shocks of 1973 and 1979, which crippled many Western economies, could have derailed Japan's progress. Japan imported nearly all its oil, and energy costs soared, but instead of stagnating, Japan adapted. The government invested heavily in energy efficiency, alternative energy research, and high-tech manufacturing. Automakers doubled down on fuel economy. The crisis became another catalyst for innovation. By the 1980s, Japan was at the peak of its global influence. Tokyo had become one of the world's most expensive cities. The yen was strong. Japanese companies were buying up high-profile assets abroad, including Rockefeller Center in New York and movie studios in Hollywood. Japan's banks were among the world's largest. The stock market reached dizzying heights, and land prices skyrocketed, particularly in Tokyo, where it was famously claimed that the Imperial Palace grounds were worth more than all the real estate in California. At home, the standard of living rose dramatically. The average Japanese family enjoyed modern housing, high-quality education, health care, and access to world-leading technology. Bullet trains zipped between major cities. Department stores overflowed with goods. The country had transformed itself into a model of stability, prosperity, and innovation. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. Much of the apparent wealth in the 1980s was built on speculation, particularly in real estate and the stock market. This would all come crashing down with the bursting of the asset bubble in the early 1990s. leading to Japan's so-called lost decade. But that's another chapter in the story. The economic miracle remains one of the most remarkable recoveries in human history. It was not just a story of numbers and growth. It was a cultural transformation, a national rebirth. Japan reinvented itself with discipline, unity, and vision. The world watched in awe as a defeated nation became a global symbol of excellence, efficiency, and resilience. It was a miracle born not of magic, but of determination and design. Bubble burst and lost decades, 1990s to 2000s. In the 1990s, Japan faced a dramatic economic downturn that marked the end of the post-war economic miracle. This period became known as the bubble burst and ushered in what came to be called the lost decades. At the end of the 1980s, Japan had one of the most overheated economies in the world. Asset prices, especially in real estate and stocks, soared to unsustainable levels. Tokyo land prices were so inflated that a single district could be worth more than entire countries. Investors speculated wildly, and the economy seemed invincible on the surface. But it was a bubble, fragile and hollow. By 1991, the bubble burst. The Nikkei stock index plummeted. Real estate prices collapsed. The consequences were far-reaching. Banks were left with enormous amounts of bad debt. Many financial institutions, once pillars of the Japanese economy, teetered on the edge of collapse or were absorbed into larger conglomerates. The Japanese government attempted to stimulate the economy through infrastructure spending and zero-interest policies, but these measures had limited success. Consumer spending declined as households saved more and worried about the future. The optimism that had defined the 1980s turned into caution and even disillusionment. Economically, the 1990s and early 2000s were marked by stagnation. Growth was minimal. Deflation persisted. Unemployment rose, challenging Japan's traditional model of lifetime employment and corporate loyalty. A generation of young people entered the workforce during this time and found only part-time or unstable jobs, leading to what would be called the freeder and lost generation phenomena. These young people lacked the job security and upward mobility their parents had enjoyed. Culturally, this economic malaise brought about reflection and a shift in values. Japan saw a rise in subcultures that expressed both rebellion and retreat, such as the hikikomori, or socially withdrawn individuals, and the continued expansion of otaku culture centered around anime, manga, and video games. These cultural currents provided escape and identity for many, even as society struggled with its direction. Politically, the era saw increased instability. The long-dominant Liberal Democratic Party briefly lost power in the 1990s, and the public grew skeptical of political elites' ability to solve economic problems. Reforms were attempted, but entrenched bureaucracy and fear of radical change often slowed progress. Leaders came and went, and confidence in government faltered. Japan also faced demographic shifts that would define its future. Birth rates declined, the population aged rapidly, and rural areas began to hollow out. These trends, combined with economic stagnation, created long-term structural challenges. Despite the difficulties, Japan remained technologically advanced and culturally influential, continuing to shape global trends in media, fashion, and innovation. But beneath the surface, the scars of the lost decades would remain a quiet force, shaping how Japan approached growth, identity, and its place in the world. Contemporary Japan, 2010s to 2020s. In the early 2010s, Japan entered a period of reflection, recalibration, and quiet resilience. The scars of the 2008 global financial crisis had not fully faded, and the devastation of the 2011 Tohoku earthquake, tsunami, and the Fukushima nuclear disaster left deep imprints on the national psyche. As the country transitioned into a new decade, the challenges it faced were not defined by a single event, but rather by a complex web of economic stagnation, demographic shifts, political change, and evolving cultural identity. The defining demographic trend of Japan in the 2010s was its aging population. With nearly a third of its citizens aged 65 or older by the late 2010s, Japan became a glimpse into the future for many industrialized nations. The The country's birth rate continued to decline, despite government incentives such as cash bonuses for new parents, subsidized childcare, and extended parental leave. Towns and villages across rural Japan began to vanish, with abandoned homes, shuttered schools, and overgrown rice fields marking the quiet retreat of communities that had existed for centuries. Urban migration intensified, concentrating population and economic activity in megacities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, even as these cities themselves began preparing for the long-term implications of a shrinking graying populace. Economically, Japan spent much of the 2010s trying to rekindle growth after decades of stagnation. The centerpiece of this effort was Abenomics, the economic policy framework introduced by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who returned to office in 2012. Built on the three arrows of aggressive monetary policy, fiscal stimulus, and structural reform, Abenomics aimed to jolt the country out of its economic malaise. The Bank of Japan implemented massive asset purchases, interest rates went negative, and government spending on infrastructure and public projects increased. In the short term, Abenomics seemed to offer some reprieve. Unemployment dropped, corporate profits rose, and the yen weakened, boosting exports. The Tokyo Stock Exchange rebounded, and foreign investment saw a modest rise. Yet, for all its ambition, many analysts concluded that Abenomics failed to address deeper systemic issues. Productivity remained sluggish, the gender gap in employment persisted, and Japan's deeply conservative corporate culture continued to resist change. Structural reforms, particularly labor market liberalization and immigration expansion, were implemented slowly or half-heartedly, limiting their long-term impact. Japan's technological and industrial landscape, however, remained robust. The nation continued to lead in advanced robotics, precision manufacturing, and consumer electronics. Automation became a key feature of Japan's strategy to cope with labor shortages, with robots being deployed not just in factories but also in restaurants, hotels, and elder care facilities. Japanese companies developed cutting-edge AI systems for logistics, autonomous vehicles, and industrial design. Meanwhile, tech-savvy retirees became a growing market segment, prompting innovation in accessibility-focused devices and services. In parallel, Japan's cultural soft power reached unprecedented global heights. The international appeal of anime, manga, and Japanese video games transformed the country into a cultural superpower. Global conventions, cosplay events, and online communities centered around Japanese media flourished, turning franchises like Attack on Titan, My Hero Academia, and Demon Slayer into international sensations. Japan's aesthetic and creative sensibilities, minimalism, melancholy, and meticulous craftsmanship captivated artists and thinkers far beyond its borders. This cultural outreach was complemented by Japan's role as a global host. In 2013, Tokyo was selected to host the 2020 Summer Olympics, which became a major symbol of national pride and international ambition. Billions were spent on infrastructure, sports facilities, and urban revitalization. But then, the COVID-19 pandemic arrived. The global crisis of 2020 affected Japan in deeply distinctive ways. Initially, Japan was praised for its low case numbers, achieved through mask wearing, social discipline, and efficient contact tracing, despite relatively limited testing. But as time went on, Japan's bureaucratic rigidity became a liability. The vaccine rollout lagged behind other developed nations due to regulatory delays and logistical missteps. Economic stimulus packages helped support small businesses and the unemployed, but uneven digital infrastructure made distribution inefficient. The Olympics, delayed by a year and held without foreign spectators, became a surreal event. One of the most extraordinary games in history, celebrated and contested in equal measure. The pandemic also accelerated deeper social trends. Remote work, long resisted in Japan's deeply in-person, hierarchy-driven office culture, suddenly became essential. This shift prompted a national debate about work-life balance, presenteeism, and the role of traditional norms in a digitizing society. Schools adopted online learning, and rural areas began to receive more interest as urban dwellers sought space and quiet amid the health crisis. At the same time, anxiety about isolation, mental health, and suicide rates became more pronounced, sparking national concern. Politically, the country saw important transitions. Prime Minister Abe resigned in 2020 due to health reasons, ending an era of stable leadership that had shaped Japanese domestic and foreign policy for nearly a decade. His successors inherited a country still reeling from the pandemic and wrestling with its future. Kishida, elected in 2021, promised a new capitalism, aiming to bridge the gap between growth and distribution, but remained cautious in policy execution. On the global stage, Japan increasingly asserted itself. With growing tensions in the Indo-Pacific, particularly due to China's military expansion and North Korea's missile tests, Japan strengthened its alliance with the United States and expanded cooperation with India, Australia, and Southeast Asian nations. It invested in cybersecurity, space defense, and advanced missile systems, marking a subtle but significant shift from the strict pacifism enshrined in its post-war constitution. The debate over revising Article 9 of the Constitution, a clause that renounces war, gained renewed momentum as national security came into sharper focus. One of the most symbolic moments of this era was the imperial transition. In 2019, Emperor Akihito became the first Japanese monarch in over 2 centuries to abdicate the throne. His son, Crown Prince Naruhito, ascended, inaugurating the Reiwa era, translated as beautiful harmony. The event was met with widespread interest and celebration, not just as a formal succession, but as a generational shift, a bridge between the memory of post-war reconstruction and the aspirations of a new century. As the 2020s progressed, Japan found itself navigating contradictions. It remained deeply traditional, yet technologically futuristic. It longed for economic growth, but valued stability and predictability. It welcomed global admiration for its culture, while wrestling with internal reform. The nation's struggles were not hidden, but neither was its strength. In its art, its policies, its people, and its quiet tenacity, Japan revealed itself not as a country clinging to the past, but as one carefully shaping its future. In this contemporary chapter, Japan was no longer just a country. It was a mirror reflecting the tensions of the modern world: growth and decline, unity and alienation, change and continuity. The story of Japan in the 2010s and 2020s is not merely one of events. It is a portrait of resilience, deliberate, graceful, and enduring. Bonus topics. The role of women throughout Japanese history. The role of women in Japanese history is a story not only of shifting social norms and structures, but also of silent endurance, quiet power, and occasional bursts of remarkable visibility. From the mystical past to the modern age, women have shaped Japan's religious traditions, artistic legacies, political institutions, and social values, often from the margins and sometimes from the very center of power. In the earliest recorded periods, long before the unification of the Japanese archipelago, women appear as central figures in myth, ritual, and rulership. According to Shinto creation mythology, the world itself was shaped by a primordial couple, the male god Izanagi and the female goddess Izanami. Together, they gave birth to the islands of Japan, and from Izanami's death in childbirth came the forces of death and renewal. Their daughter, Amaterasu, the sun goddess, became the most important deity in Shinto belief and the divine ancestor of Japan's imperial family. This mythological foundation elevated the spiritual status of women in early Japanese culture and helped justify the power of female rulers in early periods. One of the first real historical figures known by name is Queen Himiko, a shamaness queen who ruled the kingdom of Yamatai during the 3rd century CE. While Japanese records say little about her, Chinese chronicles describe her as a wise and reclusive ruler who commanded hundreds of female attendants and ruled through spiritual and ritual authority. Her story suggests that in prehistoric Japan, female leadership was not only possible, it may have been culturally rooted in the spiritual imagination of the people. The religious roles of women remained strong in early Japan. In Shinto, women served as miko, or shrine maidens, mediums, dancers, and healers who channeled the kami, or spirits. These roles were not only ceremonial, but were seen as necessary to the maintenance of harmony between the natural world, the spirits, and human society. Women also played vital roles in family rituals and ancestral worship, serving as the spiritual heart of the home. During the Heian period, aristocratic women reached a cultural peak in influence, particularly in literature and the arts. Women of the court were among the most educated and literate in the country, and because male scholars wrote mostly in Chinese, the language of officialdom, women pioneered the development of vernacular Japanese writing. This led to the creation of one of the greatest literary traditions in history. Lady Murasaki Shikibu's The Tale of Genji is widely considered the world's first novel. It offers not only poetic beauty and psychological insight, but also a rare and detailed window into the lives, loves, and emotional worlds of aristocratic women. Alongside her, Sei Shonagon's The Pillow Book captured the wit, gossip, and aesthetics of court life in elegant detail. These women shaped Japanese literary sensibilities for centuries to come. Yet this cultural flowering did not equate to broader equality. Outside the rarefied life of court, most women, especially in rural areas, were bound by customs that placed them under the authority of fathers, husbands, and sons. And as political power shifted from court nobility to warrior clans, so too did ideals of femininity change. The Kamakura and Muromachi periods saw the rise of the samurai class and the increasing codification of feudal values. In this world, women were often expected to be subservient, yet they were also capable of remarkable strength. The Anabugeisha, or female warriors, trained in martial arts and strategy, defended their homes and estates when necessary. Legendary figures like Tomo Gozen fought in actual battles, wielding swords and commanding troops. Far from passive figures, these women proved that the samurai ideal of courage and honor could transcend gender. Even so, such figures were the exception rather than the rule. As Neo-Confucianism gained influence, especially during the Tokugawa or Edo period, the status of women became more tightly controlled. The ideology emphasized hierarchical relationships: ruler over subject, parent over child, husband over wife. Women were expected to be loyal, obedient, and chaste. Marriage was no longer a matter of mutual affection, but a tool for alliance building. Daughters were often married off to secure family ties, and wives were expected to serve their husbands and in-laws with unquestioning devotion. Divorce was common, but men had far more power to initiate it. Women could be dismissed for trivial reasons like disobedience or barrenness. Despite these constraints, the Edo period also saw new forms of female agency. In merchant towns and cities, women often managed the financial affairs of family businesses, oversaw households, and participated in cultural life. The so-called chonin class of townspeople, including merchants and artisans, brought about a new kind of urban modernity, where women helped run shops, theaters, and even inns. In the pleasure quarters, female entertainers, or oiran and geisha, developed their own codes of professionalism and art. Though often romanticized, these roles were both empowering and limiting, part performance, part survival in a patriarchal economy. With the Meiji Restoration in 1868, Japan entered a period of intense modernization and westernization. The government adopted European political structures, industrial technologies, and cultural norms. Unfortunately, many of these imported norms further marginalized women. The 1898 Civil Code legally enshrined the patriarchal family system. Women lost inheritance rights, became legal dependents of their male relatives, and were excluded from voting, political office, and most professions. However, the late 19th and early 20th centuries also saw the rise of Japan's first feminist movements. Women like Kishida Toshiko and Fukuda Hideko began to speak out publicly for women's education, independence, and equality. The magazine Seito, founded by Hiratsuka Raicho in 1911, published bold essays, poetry, and critiques of the status quo. These women questioned the moral codes that confined them and demanded new visions of female identity and dignity. For the first time, Japanese feminism was born as a movement. After World War II, Japan underwent another seismic transformation. Under the Allied occupation, the 1947 Constitution granted universal suffrage and guaranteed gender equality under the law. Women were given the right to vote, own property, and access education and employment opportunities previously denied to them. Yet the deep structures of inequality proved slow to change. In the post-war decades, women entered the workforce in growing numbers, contributing to Japan's economic miracle. However, many found themselves trapped in a system that expected them to work like men while also fulfilling traditional roles as wives and mothers. The so-called M-curve in employment statistics, showing women leaving the workforce in their 30s and returning in their 40s, reflected a society where motherhood and career were often seen as mutually exclusive. Workplace discrimination, unequal pay, and lack of representation in leadership roles persisted well into the 21st century. In recent years, however, Japan has seen renewed momentum for gender equity. Women have risen to powerful positions in politics, business, and science. Figures like Tokyo Governor Yuriko Koike, astronaut Chiaki Mukai, and Nobel Prize-winning scientist Emmanuel Charpentier, though based in Europe, of Japanese heritage, have challenged long-standing norms. Grassroots movements have gained traction, addressing issues like sexual harassment, workplace discrimination, and domestic violence. Campaigns for more inclusive paternity leave, workplace reform, and support for single mothers are reshaping public discourse. Yet challenges remain. Japan continues to rank low among developed countries in global gender equality indices. Women hold only a small fraction of political offices and boardroom seats. Cultural expectations still assign primary caregiving and domestic responsibilities to women, even as many desire full participation in public life. The story of Japanese women is not one of linear progress, but of adaptation, reinvention, and resistance across time. From empresses and shamans to writers, warriors, shopkeepers, and scholars, women have been central to the making of Japanese civilization, even when the record doesn't fully reflect it. Their history is not just a supplement to Japan's story. It is Japan's story, told from a different angle, but echoing with the same beauty, strength, and enduring spirit. The mythological origins of Japan. In the beginning, before there was land, sea, or sky, the world was a formless, shapeless chaos. From this void emerged the first deities, and with them came the heavens. Among these deities were Izanagi and Izanami, a divine brother and sister, pair tasked with bringing order to the world. They stood upon the floating bridge of heaven and dipped a jeweled spear into the swirling chaos below. As they lifted the spear, droplets fell from its tip, forming the first island of Japan, Onogoro. Descending to the island, Izanagi and Izanami performed a sacred ritual of union, and from their bond were born the islands of Japan. They continued to give birth to other gods, each representing elements of nature, mountains, rivers, winds, and more. But tragedy struck when Izanami gave birth to the fire god, Kagatsuchi, and was fatally burned. Grief-stricken, Izanagi journeyed to the underworld to retrieve her. But she had already become one with the land of the dead. Upon seeing her decayed form, he fled in horror, sealing the entrance behind him. To cleanse himself of the impurities of death, Izanagi bathed in a river. As he washed, more deities were born from his body. From his left eye came Amaterasu, the sun goddess. From his right eye came Tsukuyomi, the moon god. And from his nose came Susanoo, the storm god. Amaterasu, radiant and noble, was given dominion over the heavens. Susanoo, wild and chaotic, was banished for his unruly behavior. According to the myth, Amaterasu's descendants would eventually rule the land of Japan. Her grandson, Ninigi no Mikoto, was sent down to earth to bring order, and was gifted the three sacred treasures, the mirror, the sword, and the jewel, symbols of legitimacy and divine right. Ninigi's great-grandson, Jimmu, is considered the first emperor of Japan, marking the beginning of the imperial line that continues to this day. These stories, preserved in ancient texts like the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, form the mythological bedrock of Japan's national identity. They blend the spiritual with the political, the divine with the earthly, establishing not just a country, but a sacred realm born from the gods themselves. Japan's influence on global culture. Japan's influence on global culture is one of the most remarkable examples of how a nation can deeply shape the world, not through conquest or colonization, but through the power of creativity, aesthetics, discipline, and innovation. It's a quiet revolution, one expressed in ink, silicone, silk, sound, and silence, that has rippled through nearly every domain of life, often subtly and gracefully, yet undeniably. One of the most prominent and recognizable aspects of Japan's cultural influence is in the realm of entertainment. Japanese animation, or anime, has evolved from a regional curiosity into a global phenomenon. What began with the pioneering work of artists like Osamu Tezuka, often called the god of manga, blossomed into a vast industry with massive international reach. Shows like Dragon Ball Z, Sailor Moon, Naruto, One Piece, and Attack on Titan have captivated generations of viewers around the world, transcending language and cultural boundaries. Their themes, ranging from friendship and perseverance to philosophical meditations on existence, time, and identity, resonate on a universal scale. These animated works are not just cartoons. They are complex narratives rich in character development, moral ambiguity, and artistic sophistication. Closely tied to anime is the medium of manga, Japanese comics, which are consumed by readers of all ages both in Japan and across the globe. Unlike Western comics, which historically focused on superheroes, manga offers an immense diversity of genres: romance, science fiction, horror, slice of life, historical drama, sports, and more. The storytelling techniques pioneered in manga, such as cinematic pacing, detailed panel layouts, and character-driven narratives, have influenced graphic novelists worldwide. Today you can find entire sections in bookstores around the world dedicated to translated Japanese manga, and artists across Europe, North America, and Latin America regularly cite manga as a foundational influence. Japanese video games have also had an unparalleled impact on global culture. In the 1980s and 1990s, Japan became the undisputed epicenter of the video game industry. Iconic companies like Nintendo, Sega, Sony, and Capcom brought to life characters and worlds that would become part of the collective imagination. Super Mario, The Legend of Zelda, Final Fantasy, Metal Gear Solid, Resident Evil, Pokémon. These franchises not only transformed the entertainment landscape, they also changed how stories were told through interactivity. Even Western game developers have drawn inspiration from the narrative style, mechanics, and aesthetics of Japanese game design. The Japanese philosophy of game making often centers on playfulness, emotional depth, and imaginative design, which continues to set trends globally. But Japan's cultural influence extends far beyond entertainment. In art and design, Japanese aesthetics have left a profound imprint on global sensibilities. Concepts such as wabi-sabi, which celebrates transience, imperfection, and the beauty of the natural world, have influenced everything from modern architecture to digital interfaces. The minimalist approach in Japanese traditional arts, seen in ink painting, sumi-e, tea ceremony design, and Zen rock gardens, echoes in the clean lines and calm palettes of Scandinavian interiors, Silicon Valley product design, and the branding of luxury goods. Fashion, too, has been deeply shaped by Japan. Designers like Rei Kawakubo, Comme des Garçons, Yohji Yamamoto, Issei Miyake, and Kenzo Takeda broke conventions with their avant-garde silhouettes, deconstructed forms, and philosophical approaches to clothing. In the 1980s and 1990s, Japanese fashion took the world by storm, not just through high-end designers, but through street culture. Harajuku fashion, in particular, represents a collision of whimsy, rebellion, and hyper-individualism that has fascinated style-conscious youth in cities like London, Paris, and New York. Today, Japanese fashion continues to be a major force in both luxury and subcultural style spheres. Cuisine is another arena where Japan has left an indelible mark. What was once considered exotic is now mainstream. Sushi, ramen, tempura, udon, mochi, matcha, Japanese curry, and yakitori are available in cities across the globe. And Japanese techniques and presentation have influenced Michelin-starred chefs on every continent. The emphasis on seasonality, balance, and visual harmony in Japanese cuisine has made it not only one of the most respected culinary traditions, but also a philosophical approach to nourishment and beauty. Japanese dining culture, with its rituals of gratitude, etiquette, and humility, has also gently shaped international attitudes about food consumption and hospitality. Japan's influence is also deeply philosophical. Zen Buddhism, which found its strongest and most artistic expression in Japan, has shaped global wellness movements, psychology, and even business practices. Ideas such as mindfulness, detachment, and the importance of the present moment have become central in everything from mental health therapy to productivity apps. The spread of meditation, yoga hybrids, and minimalist lifestyles owes a great deal to Japanese interpretations of Buddhist principles. Concepts like ikigai, a reason for being, shikaraganai, it cannot be helped, and gaman, enduring the seemingly unbearable with patience and dignity, have entered motivational literature, academic studies, and corporate workshops. In literature, Japan has long been respected for its rich and poetic heritage. Works like The Tale of Genji, considered the world's first novel, laid the foundation for literary introspection and psychological complexity centuries before modern European novels. Contemporary authors like Haruki Murakami, Yukio Mishima, and Kenzaburo Oe have found enthusiastic audiences around the world. Their stories, often quiet, surreal, melancholic, and deeply human, offer a unique window into modern alienation, cultural change, and the universal search for meaning. The field of robotics and technology is another area where Japan continues to lead and inspire. From early developments in industrial automation to humanoid robots capable of facial expressions and emotional responses, Japanese engineers and scientists have consistently pushed the frontier of what machines can do. In contrast to many Western views that frame robots as threats, Japanese culture often presents them as companions or helpers, a difference deeply rooted in Shinto beliefs that all objects possess a spirit, kami. This cultural lens has led to the creation of robots designed for elderly care, emotional support, and even Buddhist rituals. Japan's technocultural outlook is shaping how humanity thinks about the future of human-machine interaction. Japan's environmental and social consciousness has also been a quiet but powerful influence. The country's respect for cleanliness, order, and public discipline, seen in everything from spotless streets to punctual trains, has become a model for urban life. The concept of motenai, which expresses regret over waste, has gained traction in sustainability movements around the world. Japanese innovations in green technology, recycling systems, and public transportation continue to be studied and emulated by cities seeking efficiency and harmony. Even sports and martial arts have played a cultural ambassador role. Judo, karate, aikido, and kendo have millions of practitioners worldwide, not only for self-defense but for their moral and spiritual teachings. Japanese athletes have become international icons, and Tokyo's hosting of the 2020 Olympics, held in 2021, was a celebration of resilience, innovation, and hospitality under extraordinary global circumstances. Culturally, Japan also teaches the world how to balance deep tradition with cutting-edge modernity. Walking through Tokyo, one may find a 1,000-year-old shrine standing beside a towering neon-lit skyscraper. The ability to live with paradox, to embrace the ancient and the futuristic without contradiction, is something that fascinates the global imagination and draws people to Japanese culture. It's a way of being that doesn't demand the erasure of history for the sake of progress, but instead weaves continuity into change. All of these elements, its entertainment, aesthetics, philosophy, cuisine, technology, discipline, and spiritual outlook, combine to form a soft power that is uniquely Japanese. Without dominating or forcing its culture onto others, Japan has earned admiration, imitation, and affection from all corners of the globe. Its influence is not one of loud declarations, but of quiet resonance, subtle depth, and transformative beauty. Japan has changed the world, not by telling it what to be, but by showing it what is possible. Japan's diaspora and overseas influence. Japan's diaspora and overseas influence tell a powerful and often overlooked story of migration, adaptation, and global cultural exchange. While Japan is typically associated with its rich internal history of samurai, emperors, and economic revolutions, a parallel narrative stretches across continents, one where ordinary Japanese people ventured far from home in search of opportunity, carried their culture with them, and left lasting imprints in places thousands of miles from the archipelago. This story begins in the late 19th century, during the Meiji Restoration, when Japan began to modernize rapidly and open its borders after centuries of relative isolation. With modernization came significant upheaval. Rural communities faced new economic pressures, overpopulation, and land shortages. As Japan industrialized, many families found it difficult to adjust to the new economy and were drawn by the promise of land, labor, and prosperity abroad. Government-sponsored and private immigration programs were initiated, particularly to labor-hungry countries. One of the earliest and most significant destinations for Japanese migrants was Hawaii. Japanese workers were brought to the islands to labor on sugarcane plantations starting in the 1880s. The work was grueling, conditions were harsh, and wages were low. But the dream of earning enough to send money home, or eventually return to Japan, kept many going. Over time, communities formed. Japanese schools, newspapers, temples, and businesses took root. Despite being far from home, these emigrants preserved their language, customs, and traditions, creating a microcosm of Japanese life overseas. From Hawaii, migration spread to the U.S. mainland, especially California, Oregon, and Washington. Japanese immigrants worked in agriculture, fishing, and small businesses, often pooling resources through community cooperatives. As they became more established, however, they faced mounting hostility. Laws were passed to restrict their land ownership, citizenship, and even intermarriage. The Alien Land Laws and the Immigration Act of 1924, which effectively banned Japanese immigration to the United States, reflected the growing racial prejudice of the time. Still, the Japanese-American community persisted. The first generation, or Issei, often clung to their heritage, while the second generation, the Nisei, tried to navigate a dual identity, raised with Japanese values at home and American culture at school. This duality created tension, but also resilience, a strength that would be tested like never before during World War II. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, over 120,000 Japanese Americans, many of them U.S. citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes and imprisoned in internment camps. Families lost businesses, farms, and years of their lives. Yet even in these camps, Japanese Americans formed schools, arts programs, and sports leagues. Many young men volunteered for the U.S. military from within the camps, forming one of the most decorated units in U.S. military history. Meanwhile, in South America, Brazil became home to the largest Japanese community outside of Japan. Starting with the arrival of the ship Kasado Maru in 1908, tens of thousands of Japanese migrated to São Paulo and other regions, initially to work on coffee plantations. Life was challenging. Language barriers, cultural differences, and discrimination made integration difficult. Yet over generations, Japanese Brazilians, now numbering over 2 million, have become a vital part of Brazilian society. From agriculture to politics to cuisine, the influence is evident. In São Paulo, the Liberdade district remains a cultural hub for Japanese Brazilians, with temples, festivals, and markets that blend the two heritages. Today you'll find sushi restaurants serving dishes with tropical fruits, and you might hear Japanese spoken alongside Portuguese on the street. In Peru, the Japanese community also left a significant mark. One of the most notable examples is the election of Alberto Fujimori, a second-generation Japanese Peruvian, as president in 1990. His presidency highlighted the growing prominence of the Japanese diaspora in global politics, but also sparked debates about nationalism, identity, and political legitimacy. During his time in office, ties between Japan and Peru strengthened, and the world's attention briefly turned to the Japanese presence in Latin America in a way it never had before. Throughout the 20th century, Japanese emigrants also settled in Canada, Mexico, the Philippines, and beyond. In many of these places, they faced similar challenges: initial suspicion or discrimination, the struggle to maintain cultural identity, and the effort to educate their children in both languages. Yet the pattern repeated. Adversity gave way to integration, and cultural exchange enriched both Japan and the countries that welcomed its people. In modern times, the story of Japan's diaspora has evolved. Some descendants of these early migrants have returned to Japan, especially from Brazil and Peru, as economic shifts in the late 20th century led Japan to seek labor in foreign descendants of Japanese origin, called Nikkei. However, returnees often found it difficult to be accepted as fully Japanese. Their appearance matched, but their speech, habits, and worldview were shaped by very different experiences. Cultural dissonance and workplace discrimination made it clear that identity is more than genetics or ancestry. Meanwhile, Japan's global influence has grown in other ways, from anime and manga to martial arts, cuisine, technology, and fashion. Japanese culture has permeated nearly every corner of the world. Yet these modern exports are part of the same legacy. Japan reaching outward, shaping and being shaped by the world around it. The story of Japan's diaspora is not just about movement. It's about the transformation of identity, the preservation of culture under pressure, and the subtle power of community. Across continents, through war and peace, in celebration and hardship, the Japanese diaspora has quietly woven its thread into the global story, resilient, resourceful, and ever adaptable. It is a reminder that Japan's history does not stop at its borders. It continues in the hearts, memories, and traditions of millions who call other lands home but carry Japan with them. Japan's history is a testament to resilience, reinvention, and the enduring power of culture. From ancient earthenware to modern skyscrapers, from feudal warlords to global diplomacy, the Japanese story is one of constant transformation, always adapting, always moving forward, yet always grounded in something timeless. Through war and peace, isolation and globalization, tradition and innovation, Japan has never stopped evolving. What we've seen is not just a chronology of events, but a journey of spirit, of a people shaped by nature, by ideas, by conflict, and by beauty. It's a story that reminds us that no civilization exists in isolation, and yet, some manage to preserve their soul through every storm. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the entire history of Japan. If you found it insightful, consider liking the video, subscribing for more deep dives into history, and sharing your favorite era or moment in the comments below.